Hey, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Let's learn with Lizzie. In today's lesson, we are going to discuss the interview part 1, a prose chapter from the Class 12 NCERT book Flamingo. This chapter is extremely important for your CBSE board examination, not only because of its theme, but also because it introduces us to a very interesting aspect of modern journalism, the interview as a communication genre. We will explore why interviews became so popular, why many famous writers actually disliked interviews, and how interviews influence our understanding of famous personalities. So let's begin with the author behind this text. The chapter is taken from the introduction to a famous book called The Penguin Books of Interview. This book was edited by Christopher Silvester, a British journalist and writer. Christopher Silvester studied history at Cambridge University and he later worked as a reporter for the magazine Private Eye. He also wrote articles and features for well-known magazines such as Vanity Fair. Sylvester compiled interviews of famous personalities from different periods beginning from 1859 to the modern era. His aim was to show how the interview developed into one of the most important forms of journalism. Now let us understand the structure of this chapter. The interview is divided into two parts. In part one, which we are studying today, the author talks about the interview as a journalistic perspective. He explains how interviews became popular and also discusses the different opinions people have about them. Some people believe interviews are extremely valuable, but many famous writers believe interviews are intrusive and uncomfortable. In part 2, the chapter presents a real interview with the famous Italian writer Umberto Eco. But in this video, our focus will remain on part 1. According to Christopher Silvester, the interview as a journalistic form was invented a little over 130 years ago. Before that time, journalism mainly consisted of news, reports, and editorials. Readers did not have direct access to the personal thoughts and opinions of famous personalities. However, with the rise of interviews, this changed dramatically. Journalists began asking direct questions to famous peoples, writers, politicians, scientists, and artists. Through interviews, readers could suddenly hear the voice of these personalities directly. This made interviews one of the most fascinating forms of communication in modern journalism. Popularity of interviews. Today, interviews have become extremely common. Almost every literate person has read an interview at some point of their life. You might have seen in interviews newspapers, magazines, television programs, radio shows, or even online platforms and podcasts. Thousands of celebrities have been interviewed over the years. Because of this widespread popularity, interviews have become a major tool for communication between public figures and society. But interestingly, not everyone is happy about this development. Christopher Silvester explains that opinions about interviews vary widely. Some people believe interviews are extremely valuable. According to them, interviews are a source of truth, a form of art, and a way to understand a personality deeply. However, others, especially celebrities, often see interviews differently. They sometimes feel that interviews are an invasion of privacy. They believe journalists might ask uncomfortable or personal questions. Therefore, while some people admire interviews, others strongly dislike them. Interviews as a source of truth. Supporters of interviews believe that interviews reveal authentic information. When a journalist asks questions directly to a person, readers get the opportunity to understand their opinions, their experiences, their thoughts, and beliefs. A skilled interviewer can ask thoughtful questions that reveal hidden insights about a personality. In this sense, interviewing becomes almost like an art form. The interviewer must know what question to ask, how to guide the conversation, and how to present the responses clearly. This is why some people consider interviewing a highly creative journalistic skill. However, many famous writers and celebrities have expressed the opposite opinion. They believe interviews invade their personal space. Imagine being constantly asked personal questions about your life, thoughts, and relationships. For many writers, this feels uncomfortable. They feel the journalists are intruding into their private lives. Some writers even believe interviews can misrepresent their true personality. Because of this, many famous personalities have expressed a strong criticism of interviews. To explain this feeling, the author uses an interesting comparison. In some primitive cultures, people believed that taking a photograph could steal a person's soul. Although this belief may sound strange today, it reflects the fear that photography captures something deeply personal. Similarly, some writers feel that interviews can take away a part of their identity or privacy. When they reveal personal thoughts during interviews, they sometimes feel emotionally exposed. Thus, the author uses this comparison to show why interviews can make people uncomfortable. One writer who expressed such concern was V.S. Naipaul, a famous Nobel Prize winning author. Naipaul believed that some people are wounded by interviews. According to him, when writers speak openly in interviews, they may feel that they have lost a part of themselves. Their private thoughts suddenly become public. This can make writers feel vulnerable or misunderstood. Naipaul's statement highlights the psychological impact interviews may have on an individuals. Another writer who strongly disliked the interviews was Lewis Carroll, the author of the famous children's book Alice in Wonderland. Carroll had what the text describes as a horror of the interviewers. He refused to give interviews throughout his life. He disliked being admired or treated as a celebrity. Because of this, he avoided people who wanted to interview him or even collect his autograph. Afterward, he would often tell stories about how he successfully avoided such situations, sometimes with amusement and satisfaction. Perhaps the strongest criticism of interviews came from Rudyard Kipling, the famous author of The Jungle Book. According to his wife's diary, Kipling once said that interviews were immoral, cowardly, and vile. He even described interviews as a crime. In his opinion, no respectable person should ask for an interview or agree to give one. This shows how strongly some writers felt about protecting their privacy from journalists. However, the author also highlights an interesting irony. Although Rudyard Kipling criticized interviews so strongly, he himself once interviewed the famous writer Mark Twain. This contradiction shows that even those who dislike interviews sometimes participate in them. It reflects the complicated relationship between writers and the media. On one hand, they dislike media attention. On the other hand, interviews help them communicate with readers. Another famous writer mentioned in the chapter is H.G. Wells, the author of science fiction classics like The Time Machine and The Invisible Man. Wells described interviews as the interviewing ordeal. The word ordeal suggests something stressful or uncomfortable here. Despite this, Wells frequently gave interviews. Later in his life, he even interviewed the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. This again shows that writers often have mixed feelings about interviews. The American novelist Shaul Bellow used a very powerful metaphor to describe interviews. He said interviews felt like thumbprints on his windpipe. This metaphor suggests a feeling of pressure or suffocation. Imagine someone pressing their thumb against your throat. It creates discomfort and restricts your freedom. Similarly, Bellow felt interviews placed pressure on him and limited his personal freedom. This metaphor vividly captures the anxiety some writers feel during the interviews. Despite all these criticisms, the author reminds us that interviews remain extremely important. According to journalist Dennis Brain, most of our impressions about famous personalities come through interviews. Think about it. How do we learn about the opinions of writers, actors, scientists, politicians? Very often, it is through interviews in newspapers, magazines, or television programs. Therefore, interviews continue to play a very important role in shaping public's understanding. Because interviews influence public perception, interviewers hold enormous power. The interviewer decides which question to ask, how the conversation will proceed, which part of the interview will be published. This means the interviewer can significantly influence how the public views a personality. Christopher Silvester points out that interviewers today hold a position of unprecedented power and influence. Now, let us quickly summarize the major themes of part 1. The first theme is power of media. Interviews shape how society understands public figures. The second theme is privacy versus public curiosity. Celebrities want privacy, but the public wants to know about their lives. The third theme is contradiction of writers. Many writers criticize interviews but still participate in them. And finally, the chapter highlights the growing importance of journalism in modern society, how the journalism is influencing the source of modern information. The chapter also uses several literary techniques. For example, the metaphor, thumbprints on his windpipe, expresses the pressure of interviews. There is also an analogy comparing interviews with the primitive belief that photographs steal the souls. And then comes the irony, which appears in the example of Rudyard Kipling, who criticized interviews but also conducted one himself. And finally, these devices make the discussion more vivid and engaging by giving more examples and evidences. The author supports arguments using examples of famous writers. The chapter conveys that interviews are a powerful communication tool. They help society understand public figures. However, they also raise questions about privacy and ethics. Thus, interviews are both valuable and controversial. For board exams, remember these key points. First, the interview became popular around 130 years ago. Second, many writers dislike interviews because they feel interviews invade privacy. Third, several famous writers criticized interviews, including V.S. Naipaul, Lewis Carroll, Rudyard Kipling, Saul Bellow. Finally, despite criticism, interview remain one of the most powerful tools of modern journalism. So now let us focus on some possible board exam questions. Why do some writers dislike interviews? What does Saul Bellow mean by thumbprints on his windpipe? Why did Lewis Carroll avoid interviews? Discuss different opinions about interviews presented in the chapter and explain the power and influence of interviews in the modern journalism. To conclude, the interview part 1 explores the complex relationship between the writers and the journalists. It shows us that interviews can be both valuable and controversial. They allow us to understand famous personalities, but they also raise important questions about privacy and media ethics. Understanding this balance is essential in today's world where media plays such an important role in shaping public view and opinion. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching the video till the end. If you felt like the video was quite helpful for you, kindly please hit the like, share and subscribe button and see you soon in the upcoming video.